We're going to devote time now to bills dealing with crime from two different approaches. Joining me are Republican Senator Brandon Beach of Alpharetta. He's chair of the Senate Economic Development and Tourism Committee, too. Also here is Democratic Representative Michelle Au of Johns Creek. And so I want to thank you for both being on Lawmakers. And Chairman Beach, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you.
Let's start with your Senate Bill 7, and which I understand is also called the 3 Gs bill, gangs, guns, gone. Tell us what it's all about.
Let me just say this. The role of government is to keep its citizens safe. And right now, people don't feel safe. You've got homicides up in third year in a row in Atlanta in Sunday's paper, 170 homicides this year. And we've got to get tough on crime. If you listen to Governor Kemp's speech, State of the State, he spent a good portion on crime and gang crime, violent crime, and backing the law enforcement. We've made it a caucus priority. Our Lieutenant Governor, Burt Jones, has made it a top priority of his to fight crime. This bill, what it does, and I got this idea actually from Fulton County Judge Craig Schwall. He and I were having lunch, and he told me there's a revolving door, and we've got to get tough on these violent crimes. So basically what this does is if you go into a convenience store and rob somebody at gunpoint, before you serve a day of that armed robbery sentence, you have a pre-enhanced 10-year mandatory sentence that cannot be changed by a DA or a Superior Court judge. It's a 10-year mandatory sentence, and we're going to get tough on violent crime.
So 10-year minimum without, and no ability for pardon or parole or early release?
No, none. And we've got to get that message. I would say what we need to do after we pass this, we have to have some kind of public service announcements to go out to these young folks. Because when you look at these murders that happened this year, 19 of them were teenagers. We're losing our youth. We need to tell our youth that if you're going to commit a crime at gunpoint, there are consequences, and you're going to go to jail for 10 years, mandatory minimum sentence, and no DA or judge is going to be able to help you. So you better think twice before you commit a crime at gunpoint.
Okay, so I'm going back and forth because you have a different bill, but I wanted to get your reaction before we move on.
So I do agree with Senator Beach that the role of government is to keep people safe. And I don't see how you can have this conversation about violent crime, which we all care about and which we're all concerned about, without addressing the role of gun violence in that violent crime. And I think that I wish sometimes that our colleagues across the aisle would attack with as much vigor prevention of this type of violent crime as they do prosecuting the crime after the fact. My bills have to do with gun safety, and this takes place in the setting of a state with some of the most lax gun laws in the country, right? This is in the setting of having passed SB 319, which is the permitless carry law, which enables people to, without a background check, carry loaded guns in public. There are several ways to address having increases in violent crime that does involve guns, as Senator Beach noted. 3 of the bills that I am introducing that have to do with common sense gun safety have to do with extending background checks to cover private gun sales and transfers, which include almost 40% of gun sales that are not through a federally licensed gun dealer and do not have to pass through a background check in order for someone to take a gun home. Second bill has to do with introducing a 3-day waiting period, which can build in a cooling off period to diffuse these kinds of crimes of impulse or passion that can lead to interpersonal violence, domestic violence, and most prominently, suicide as a result. And the third bill has to do with something else that Senator Beach touched on, which is guns in the hands of adolescents and children, right? And this is a safe storage law that I'm going to drop later this week, either tomorrow or the next day, that prohibits people who have guns from allowing them to be accessed by minors.
Sounds like they're similar to the federal legislation. Is that what you're going for?
Well, especially with the universal background check, it aims to close a loophole in federal legislation. Current federal legislation requires background checks for guns that are purchased through federally licensed firearms dealers. However, private gun sales and transfers, which are making up increasing percentage of gun sales, do not have to undergo this background check process. And that's an increasingly large loophole, particularly in the setting of a state that has removed one more safety net from having people required to go through a background check in order to carry loaded guns in public. Yeah. So I think we're after the same thing. I think that Senator Beach is absolutely right that we're all very concerned about violence in our streets. We're concerned about our children, and these are two ways coming from two different angles to address these issues. And I hope that we can work together to address the preemptive, preventative aspects of violent crime, as well as some of the bills that he is introducing.
You voted in favor of the permitless carry bill, though, right?
Correct.
And
I'm pro Second Amendment, but these individuals that are committing these crimes are violent people, and they need to be punished so, and that's why it's a mandatory sentence.
So a mandatory sentence would mean locking them up for a long time. It puts a lot on the criminal justice system, corrections, the whole bit. Anything in the works to help with that part of it?
Well, our
'Cause they're
previous
suffering right now.
Governor Deal, we worked on criminal justice reform, but those were nonviolent criminals. And I'm okay with rehabilitating those folks. These folks that are committing crimes that are violent and putting guns to people's head when they carjack them or when they rob a convenience store, they need to go and pay the consequences, and that's what this does. And Judge Schwal told me it's a revolving door down at Fulton County, and I've heard it from the police officers too, law enforcement. It's the same folks they keep arresting. So we've got to get tough on these violent, what I call 7 deadly sins, violent crimes, and let them know there's going to be consequences.
So the 7 deadly sins law isn't enough?
No, I mean, I think that's what we need to do, and that's what SB 7 does.
Okay.
It addresses those violent felony crimes with a gun.
Okay, let's talk about the district attorney's aspect to all of this. It kind of takes it out of their hands, the ability to make negotiations when it comes to sentencing.
And I think we need to take it out of their hands on these violent criminals. And it's we've got to do something about this crime. It's out of control. And look, we have a big economic engine in our city called the World Congress Center. And the convention business is a very competitive business. And if we want to continue to have conventions, Super Bowls, and college football championships, we've got to be known as a safe city. And right now, we are not seen that way. We are seen as a higher murder per capita than Chicago. That's not good. And we've got to get that under control. And the only way you're going to do that is with tougher penalties and let these young kids that are committing these crimes know that there are going to be serious consequences if you commit a crime with a gun.
Yeah. Giv, I want to turn to you, but given what you were here when the bill passed, permitless carry, and it passed overwhelmingly with the Republicans, do you see your bills getting anywhere this legislative session?
Well, I have to say that gun safety legislation is being tough on crime, right? So let's talk about universal background checks for a second. What universal background checks does is that it precludes people who have a criminal history, people who are convicted felons, this revolving door that you talk about, people who have committed violent crimes in the past. It precludes these types of people from getting access to guns, which I think we can all agree is a good goal to have if we want to cut down on violent crime. The other way that I think it addresses some of the shared concerns and priorities that we have is that permitless carry, when we have these giant loopholes and inability to background check people, it actually makes it a less safe environment for our law enforcement, right? So I know we all support keeping law enforcement safe as they go about doing their jobs and keeping the rest of us safe. So a lot of gun safety regulation does have to do with addressing violent crime, preempting violent crime, and addressing the problems where the root are.
Explain the bill that deals with the locking up the guns a little better.
Yeah. So the #1 cause of death in children and adolescents in this country is actually gun violence, right? This is a statistic that we don't get to ignore, we don't get to turn away from, and that is what this safe storage bill deals with, right? It is what I view as a pediatric health bill, and what it does is it simply requires that any gun in a home or outside your home that can be accessed by a minor is stored securely, separate from its ammunition, with either a trigger lock or in a safe, or any number of ways that are readily accessible and readily available and not that expensive in order to keep these weapons safe and away from the hands of children and adolescents who might use them unsafely, right? It seems like common sense, just the same way that we require children to be in car seats, right? That we require certain types of, locks on or fences around pools. It's really a pediatric health bill, and it deals with what we cannot avoid seeing as the #1 cause of death in children and teenagers.